So we are in already the second week of our Joseph series. And last week we started this series looking at the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. And one of the things that we noticed right off the bat is that Joseph's family is totally dysfunctional. It's a mess. Joseph's dad, last week we read how he causes divisions in the family by picking favorites. And then these different sons, they start colluding together and they want to murder their brother Joseph, right? But thank goodness they change their minds. That doesn't happen. And instead, they decide to sell him into slavery. And then they end up lying to their father that he's dead and a wild animal destroyed him. And so we recognized last week, man, as we were reading through chapter 37 and looking at chapter 38, this family is a mess. And when we got to chapter 38, we didn't even read chapter 38 because it's one of the more messy chapters of even the book of Genesis. It's pretty terrible. We realize just the degrees of the brokenness that has gone through this family. We looked a little bit at Judah's story, Joseph's brother Judah, and man, his daughter is a prostitute and sleeps with her dad. And it's one of the more disturbing chapters of the book of Genesis. Judah is sort of this monster. And we know that this story is a story of restoration and redemption, right? At least we think we do. I said that last week. Hopefully I wasn't lying, right? Hopefully this is a story of redemption and restoration, because as we're reading through it, it doesn't look too hopeful, at least last week, seeing the brokenness in this family. And we were left puzzled last week about how God will ever be able to fix just all of this dysfunction and brokenness. Now this week, we are on that journey. We are working towards seeing how God will redeem and restore this family. But before we get to that final chapter, before we see the redemption take place, right, this series of chapters we're in right now, chapter 39 and 40, sort of make us wrestle. These are definitely wrestling chapters. We will eventually reach the point where we'll see the redemption, but one of the even bigger issues that we'll see this morning in these particular chapters is kind of summarized by this question. Why does bad stuff happen to good people? Someone will do something good and man, they'll just have something terrible happen to them. You know, I actually get asked that exact question. Why do bad things happen to good people? I get asked that question when I was helping lead the youth group. I would get asked that question by the youth every single year. Every single year we would need to talk about it. I'd get questions even throughout the year. This is one of those significant life questions that we wrestle with. And this is one of those significant questions that have been asked for millennia. And unfortunately, in this story of Joseph, we are working towards seeing that redemption of Joseph's story. And when we reach those final chapters, chapter 50, we'll see a more direct answer to that question. Why do bad things happen to good people? But unfortunately, chapters 39 and 40 don't fully answer that question for us. We have to wait till 50. We have to wait till next week. But yet, we will try our best to understand Joseph's story inside of these passages. And who knows? We might not be able to directly answer the question, right? Why do bad things happen to good people? But we might get an answer to a different question that we weren't expecting. Maybe something we weren't expecting from this passage. So I suppose we just need to dig in and see. So let's dig into this morning's passage, and we'll see what we discover together. So we're going to be in Genesis chapter 39, and we're actually going to read through the entire chapter 39 together. There's 23 verses, and I'll read it for you. This is our key passage for this morning. It says the following: Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered and he lived in the house of the Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household and entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything in the care he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. With me in charge, he told her, "My master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day, he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out the house. Then when she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and ran out the house, she called to her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story, that the Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison wardens. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. So chapter 39. This chapter has quite a bit in there, and the following chapter afterwards is in chapter 40. It continues on, and we hear more about Joseph's story in prison, and he sits in prison for years. And while he's in prison, he helps interpret two different dreams, right? And lo and behold, if you remember, Joseph had two dreams at the beginning of the story, and then Pharaoh has two dreams at the end of the story. But Joseph interprets two dreams while he's sitting in prison in this low moment. And anyways, these two dreams that he interprets, he tells the people, "Hey, if these dreams come true, if I tell you the truth and I'm helping you and doing this favor, please do one thing for me. Please remember me. Remember me. Mention my name to Pharaoh. Try to get me out of here. Whatever you do, just don't forget about me." And here's the very end, the last verse to chapter 40. It says the following. The chief cupbearer, he read his dream. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. And so this is sort of a depressing story. This moment in chapter 39 and 40 here that we read 39, we heard a little bit about 40. This segment of Joseph's story can be kind of depressing because Joseph does the right thing, the honorable thing, but is punished and thrown in prison. And Joseph helps people. He meets needs. He helps people, but then is forsaken, forgotten. And Joseph's story so far Pretty much wherever he is, whoever he's with, everyone who ends up betraying him, right? Whether it's his brothers or Potiphar's wife or Potiphar himself or the royal cupbearer, right? Joseph's story is one where he is faithful, but man, time after time, he just gets betrayed. He's betrayed yet faithful. And we're going to explore that theme a little bit more. Betrayed yet faithful. See, Joseph does good. He does good stuff, but then receives evil. You know, there's this old popular phrase, goes way back, but an old popular phrase that goes, the nice guys finish last. Anyone familiar with that? Nice guys finish last. Yeah. And it sure seems like, as we're reading through this story, at least so far, Joseph keeps finishing last. Those nice guys finish last. And Joseph's story can feel unfair as we're reading it. And that's because, to a large degree, it is unfair, right? This is unfair. Joseph was innocent, and he's punished and sent to prison. He was actually due a reward, right? But he's forsaken and forgotten. And you know, there's been more than once that I've sat right across from someone, looked into their eyes, and as I looked in their eyes, they told me square to my face, right? I do not believe in God. And the reason is because bad stuff keeps happening to good people. I do not believe in God because of stories like Joseph, like what we just read. I mean, why would God ever allow a situation like Joseph's story to occur? The injustice of this. And it's at this moment that I usually have to pause and make a clarification. Okay? We need to make a little bit of a clarification. Because we need to clarify that Joseph's story is actually even worse than that. See, Joseph's story, what we just read, is not simply a story about bad things happening to good people. It's also a story about good things happening to bad people. Not just bad things happening to good. There's good happening to bad people, right? Like the people who do those bad things, right? Potiphar throws him into prison. The cupbearer just leaves him, forgets him, and walks away. Now, typically, this clarifying point gets me a puzzled look, right, from that person sitting across from me. There's a few puzzled looks in this room right now because I think I actually just made this dilemma worse. It actually sounds worse now, right? But as you'll see, this is a critical clarification. Critical. Because one of the things we notice in chapter 39 and 40 especially is that everyone who encounters Joseph is blessed. Everybody that like Joseph runs into is blessed. What's the good things, those good deeds, that good stuff that all the people in the story did to earn these blessings, right? Like Potiphar was blessed, the prison warden was blessed, the cupbearer was blessed. But if we just pause for a minute and think about it, they didn't really do any good stuff to earn any blessings, right? In this story, it's almost like Joseph is a walking around blessing machine, right? And pretty much everyone he bumps into, he starts just showering them with blessings. Genesis 12, there's a passage that I'm reminded of as I think about Joseph being this blessing machine and everyone he bumps into just like he starts spilling out blessings onto them. And in Genesis chapter 12, there's a promise that God gives to Joseph's great-grandpa, Abraham, right? And part of that promise God makes to Abraham is that Abraham was going to be a giant walking blessing machine, right? And just about everyone he bumps into, he's going to start spilling blessings into the world. So he says things in Genesis 12. God declares to Abraham this promise and says things like, Abraham, I'm going to make your name great. you will be a blessing. It goes on, Abraham, all the peoples on earth are going to be blessed. They will be blessed through you. Right? You're going to walk around and just be spilling blessings everywhere you go. And as we read through Joseph's story, it seems like Joseph is that living, walking conduit of blessing and favor to others, right? That we kind of hear about in this promise that was made back to Abraham. In fact, there's this key structure to chapter 39 that we just read that will help us understand what's happening in this passage. So chapter 39, if we want to understand chapter 39, there's this literary infrastructure that's built into this passage that we need to explore and reveal. So I've got some slides to help us do that. The first one we'll put up there. The first thing we notice as we read through this passage, verse 1 gives us a little context before we're thrown into the story. But right off the bat, like verse 2, we see that the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with him. And then this chapter, it ends in the very last verse, right? Verse 23, and it says, and the Lord was with Joseph, right? So this chapter almost starts and ends with this key statement that the Lord was with Joseph. And then when it comes after verse 2, right? In verse 4, we hear that Joseph's master, Potiphar, sees that the Lord is with Joseph and entrusts everything to him. And later on, in verse 22, we hear almost the exact same phrase. Joseph's new master, the prison warden, sees that the Lord is with Joseph and entrusts everything into his care. And it goes a little bit further. There's even more parallels we start to know, because verse 5, as this story continues, right? Joseph becomes a conduit of blessing, right, for Potiphar. Blessings rain down on the bad guys, right, specifically through the good guy. And it happens again in verse 21. As we start ending this chapter, Joseph becomes a conduit of blessing for the prison warden. And blessings rain down on even the bad guys, right? Specifically through the good guy. Now, in between the beginning and the end of this story, these two kind of parallel tracks that happen, there's this whole scene in the middle, verse 7 through 20, where it's the temptation. We just read it, right? And that particular chapter, it almost compares and contrasts, because the very last chapter, chapter 38, there was this story with Judah, right? And Judah is tempted by a woman as well. And so we see, like, between this chapter and the last chapter, there's these parallel stories happening, this temptation moment where Judah is tempted and Joseph is tempted. But Judah, right, he gives into his temptations, the advances of the woman. He falls into temptation. But then there's no jail time for Judah, right? But yet Joseph, he doesn't give in. He's honorable. And yet he goes to jail despite his innocence. Judah is the bad guy in the story, remember? And Judah sees that the Lord is with his brother Joseph early on, right? And Judah was the mastermind behind Joseph's betrayal. And check this out. By the end of the story, Joseph becomes the conduit of blessing for even Judah. Like, what is going on in this Joseph story? Chapter 39 and 40 are quite puzzling. It's all backwards. It's not what we would expect. But it gets even worse. It's not simply that the nice guy finishes last, right? It's not simply that bad things happen to the good person, right? In this story, blessings rain down on the bad guys, specifically through the good guy. And that's not fair at all. And this is the exact scenario that person sitting across from me at the table would say, see, this is why I don't believe in God. But can I make a very important observation for you? For a moment, forget about all the busyness in chapter 39, all the things that are happening. I just want you to focus on one key observation. And I'll put it up on the slides. I'll highlight it for you. This chapter starts and ends by clarifying for us, beyond a doubt, the Lord is with Joseph. See, the Lord is there at the beginning and end of this chapter. The Lord never forgot about Joseph, like the cupbearer did. The Lord never betrayed Joseph, like his brother Judah. The Lord never forsook Joseph, like Potiphar. The Lord never left. Was there the whole time with Joseph, all through this chapter. Now, the person sitting across the table from me right now, if I would look them in the eyes and hear them say, I do not believe in God because bad stuff happens to good people. And Joseph's story, it answers us and says, yes, bad stuff happens to good people. But, here's one of the key things we learned from chapter 39. But, it's not because God isn't there. Bad stuff happens to good people. But Genesis 39 doesn't, so far it doesn't quite give us the direct full answer. We got to wait till chapter 50 next week, right? The why comes next week. But what we just read, chapter 39, it does remove some potential explanations. Why does bad stuff happen to good people? Well, bad stuff happens to good people, and it's not because God isn't there. Bad stuff happens to good people, and it's not because God doesn't love you. And the answer to why is killing us. It's driving me crazy, right? I literally just want to turn the page to 50. Let's get there. But we're all going to have to wait like Joseph did, right? And wait. And I suppose you could cheat. You could cheat like Judah this week and read ahead, right? I might not say that during second service. Cheat by reading your Bible? Okay, maybe I'm going to skip that part. But here's what I will give you, okay? To appease till next week, here's what I will give you. Joseph's story, these chapters, Joseph's story is one of the key stories of the book of Genesis, the entire book of Genesis. You know that over 1/4 of the chapters of the book of Genesis are about Joseph's story. The book of Genesis, this one story we're reading, right? There is so much more time spent on Joseph. Compare that to creation of the universe. 2 chapters, Joseph, 13 chapters, right? So it would be fair to conclude that there must be something special about Joseph's story. There must be something critical to the message of Genesis. There must be something critical to the message of the Bible, tucked away in these pages. If you read carefully through the whole Bible, you'll discover why Joseph's story is so significant. And it's because Joseph's story is an echo. It's an echo of Jesus' story. Joseph is living in part Jesus' story. Joseph is revealing in part Jesus' story. Now, what I'm going to do in this closing section here is I'm going to try to teach you to hear that echo. Because sometimes we read through the book of Genesis, we read through Joseph, we read through chapter 39, and we don't hear it. I'm going to try to help you hear the echo of Jesus' story in Joseph's story. So some of the parallels that we start to notice right away as we think about, these two stories are similar, he says. Joseph has 12 brothers, and Jesus has 12 disciples. Okay, well, one of Joseph's brothers betrays him, and one of Jesus' disciples betray him, right? And this is, so far, you might be thinking, okay, this is merely maybe a coincidence, right? Are they really like the echo of the same story? Well, listen closer for the echo. Joseph's brother is named Judah, and Judah betrays Joseph over a meal. And Jesus' disciple is named Judas and betrays him over a meal. Oh, and by the way, Judah and Judas are the exact same name. Exact same name. One's the Hebrew version, one's the Greek version. Same name. And even the authority figures in each one of their stories at this betrayal, right? Reuben and Pilate, they both recognize that Joseph and Jesus are innocent. They're about to be murdered, but they're innocent. And so they desire to save them, right? Because they don't want innocent blood on their hands. And so both of them, though to varying degrees, fail. But both Joseph and Jesus are actually turned over and they're sold, right? And what are they sold for? A bag of silver. Joseph, it was 20 pieces of silver sold him into slavery. Jesus, 30 pieces sold him into death. And are we starting to think these are still coincidences, right? That's a lot of coincidences. Well, I'll do the speed round, okay? Here's the speed round. They both traveled down to Egypt. They both were stripped of their garments. They're both favored by God and then envied because of it. They both do the right thing and then are punished. They both help people and are forsaken. They both are these suffering servants who are betrayed yet faithful, and through their innocent suffering, right, they bring about the redemption and restoration of many. You know, last week we heard part of Judah's story. And I was describing it to you, we maybe sort of wondered, like, how could Joseph's story be even greater than that? Like, how could Joseph's story ever overshadow this incredible transformation that's happening in Judah's story? Well, do you hear the echo? It's not Joseph's story that overshadows Judah. It's Jesus' story that's overshadowing over a quarter of the book of Genesis. But the most interesting part of comparing Joseph and Jesus is to notice where their stories are different. See, Joseph becomes the conduit of blessing to Potiphar's household, to the prison warden. And blessings rain down on the bad guy, specifically through the good guy. But Jesus becomes the conduit of blessing for the whole world. Blessings rain down on the bad guys, specifically through the good guy. See, we thought that maybe Joseph was the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, right? That promise to Abraham, I'm going to make you into a blessing machine, right? Abraham, I'm going to make your name great. You will be a blessing. Abraham, all the peoples on the earth, like everyone, all the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. But Joseph was only ever an echo. Jesus is the fulfillment. Now, here's where the rubber meets the road in our own lives, in our own homes. Joseph's story is one where God takes a dysfunctional, broken home, a broken family, and we heard about that dysfunction last week, and God takes this dysfunctional family and he redeems and restores them. And what did it take for their family to be restored? They needed to hear an echo of Jesus right in the center of their broken home. And Jesus is so powerful, right? He's so powerful that he's able to heal with just an echo, just an image. You know, in Luke chapter 7, there's this story of a centurion who comes to Jesus. He actually sends a messenger to Jesus. He's a Roman soldier, and he's got a dying daughter, on her deathbed at home. And this centurion sends a messenger to Jesus saying, hey, I recognize you don't even have to be physically here and present. All I need is your word, and you can heal my whole household. All you need to do is speak a word from far off. Your echo is powerful enough to heal my daughter. And Jesus turns to everyone in this scene in chapter 7, in Luke chapter 7, right? And Jesus marvels And he basically responds to this messenger and says, finally, someone understands me. Finally, someone gets me. So how do we invite Jesus into our homes? How does Jesus become the conduit of blessing and restoration for our homes? And come on now. Come on now. You already know. What did Potiphar and the prison warden do? They entrusted Joseph with everything. Are you ready to entrust Jesus with everything? If you are, I'm going to give you an opportunity to do that right now. This next moment is not about me and you. This next moment is about you and Jesus. So spend this next moment, just close your eyes, bow your heads with me, and let Jesus be your focus. Wherever you are at, whatever story you have, this is a moment that you can just pray and ask Jesus, right where you're sitting, Jesus, would you be the center of my home? And Jesus, we realize that for you to become the center of our homes, we need to ask you to be the center of our lives. Sometimes there are things maybe we've been holding on to that we need to surrender to you. Maybe you're at a moment in your life where you need to surrender to Jesus. Maybe it's a struggle with sin, and you need to confess that to him and ask for forgiveness. Maybe it's a struggle with control. You need to confess to him and ask for humility. Whatever you've been holding on to, this is that moment for you to entrust it into Jesus' care. So Jesus, we recognize that it's by your death and resurrection that blessings rain down on the bad guys, specifically through the good guy. And your death on the cross was no accident or mistake. You know what? The nice guy did finish last. And it was so that each one of us could finish first. Man, Jesus, I just pray that those who asked you to be the center of their homes, the center of their lives, would look to you this week, would walk with you, and would listen for your echo in the story of their lives. Amen. I just want to leave you with a quote before we sing our final song together. And this is a quote that's kind of been playing through my mind this week as I was thinking about this passage and this message. And so I just wanted to share it with you. And then we'll sing the final song. But this quote is from C.S. Lewis, from Mere Christianity, and it goes like this. Imagine yourselves as a living house. And God comes in to rebuild that house. At first, perhaps, you can understand what he's doing. He's getting the drains right and stopping the leaks in the roof and so on. You knew that those jobs needed doing, and so you are not surprised. But presently, he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abdominally and does not seem to make any sense. What on earth is he up to? The explanation is that he's building quite a different house from the one that you thought of. Throwing out a new wing here, putting on an extra floor there, running up towers, making courtyards. You thought you were being made into a decent little cottage, but he's building a palace. He intends to come and live in it himself. Would you stand with us now for the closing song?